Yes. We are live. Hello. And welcome to this
Not therapy hour. I know. I was like, I don't know the introduction to say it, but then I'm like, wait, you know the first line.
I am Brandon Testers.
I'm Olivia Kingdosia.
And I'm a licensed therapist. This is not therapy for very, very many reasons. Olivia is a mental health practitioner, I think is the official term, but an intern therapist doing her internship in pursuit of licensure. I'm just going to adjust our camera here a little bit because I tend to sit forward. And this is not therapy, it is an open conversation. Olivia and I are here talking with one another. I'm pouring my tea off screen for a moment, or off camera. Olivia and I are here talking with one another and talking with all of you. Until and unless any of you participate in the chat, our knowledge of you is mostly guesswork, right? We're doing our best to make guesses about who you are, why you might be here, what you might be interested in, how you are interpreting what we're saying, etc. If you are willing and able to write in the chat, we very much appreciate that because it gives us a lot more information about who you are and what you are interested in. And like any human communication, when two people are paying attention to one another, everything that they notice the other person doing impacts them. So we're saying and doing things that we think, that we hope will be helpful and relevant to people, or at least interesting. And if that's the case, if something prompts something in you, great. If you say stuff to us, then what you say, we read and it impacts us. So in practical terms, we're going to be talking about whatever we're talking about. Please feel free to jump in at any point. In fact, we actively request and encourage it. Don't worry about the topic we're discussing. We don't need to wait for an opening or try to avoid taking us off on a tangent or anything like that. We're just going off on tangents. Anyway, I kind of hate that phrasing just generally. Not the phrasing, but the concept that there's a way a conversation could go that it shouldn't. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? This is not a thing that we should discuss, even though we're all interested in it.
Me learning therapy here, me being like, but what if I choose the wrong path? But there is no wrong path in dialogue with the client. Yeah.
We're all just responding to one another. And yeah, we, especially in this format, are not going to take big pauses and just sit and stare at the camera to leave openings. So just don't wait for that. Put things down.
Brandon hates silence.
I don't hate silence.
You don't enjoy it.
I have specific thoughts about it. I do not like when people use silence as a weapon, including therapists. And by that, I mean silence, depending on the context, is uncomfortable for people. Obviously, all of us, nobody's uncomfortable when there's silence while they're asleep, right? But in certain contexts where we feel especially we should be talking, someone should be saying something, either me or the other person, and nobody's saying something, then the silence becomes uncomfortable.
I think I left one of my therapists because she utilized silence so much.
Yeah.
I gotta go.
It's standard taught to therapists that you have to learn to be comfortable in the silence and not break the silence, because sometimes it's important to let the tension build in that silence until the client is kind of forced to break it. I don't believe that. It's not that I like or dislike silence. I'm happy to sit in silence, even with clients sometimes. What I don't like is when it's I am allowing it to be silent so that they grow more uncomfortable and are eventually forced to say something. But yeah, we'll talk about whatever. You talk about whatever. It's just a conversation. There can be questions and answers involved in that, and it can be jokes, and it can be we're all contributing and sharing ideas. I did listen to, was it last week?
I think it was last week.
Last week, one of our commenters mentioned the Radiolab episode about aphantasia that I did listen to in the interim, although I still haven't gone and read the source material or the research or anything, but listened to the episode and sent you a big old message.
You sent me a big old message.
So, we impact one another. For real, This isn't a TV show.
Though it feels like it sometimes, or it seems like that. What is the word?
It's a good. We can talk about that.
I
But
change it all the time.
by
now.
the thing that we've discussed, it would be seems.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
Not feels.
It seems like it, or I think it looks like, or I think of it that way, or whatever.
I perceive it as that sometimes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Comes across that way to me, whatever.
Oh my god.
We can get into that. But to finish our introductory stuff, I'm a therapist. Olivia is a therapist. I'm licensed and she is an intern. We both work with a practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family therapy. We are launching some therapy groups, including one that we mentioned last week.
I think it's on Psychology Today.
That's on
Caitlin put an
Psychology
ad,
Today.
yeah.
Do you know what the title of it is for people to search it up? I mean, you can look up Effective Artistry, the practice, and the information.
Yeah, it's
will
on
be
there. I couldn't. Just
Or
put the word tarot and effective artistry and it'll be there.
yes, I'll turn it over to you in a minute when I finish this, and you can kind of describe it a little bit and tell people how to find it. But it's a really cool group that will be launching in February, I believe. We can only do therapy with people in the state of Illinois. We also work with a couple of executive functioning coaches who can work with people anywhere in the world via the internet. Keep in mind, those of you who do participate in the chat, that this is a public forum. We'll read off all the comments as they come in because we stream on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch simultaneously, and you only see comments from other people on your platform. So if you're on Facebook and we get comments from Twitch, you won't see them. So we read them out so that everybody can see what's going on and what we're responding to. I think that's more or less it. Yeah, tell us a little bit about your group.
Well, it's a great question, Brandon.
You've been talking about this.
Yeah, Caitlin's been more on the writing the actual descriptions and I've just been making the ads for it, so I haven't.
So Caitlin Miller is one of our staff therapists. She's been on the stream a lot. She was on the stream almost every week for a year. And she is the other therapist that will be co-facilitating
Yes,
this
thank
with Olivia.
We basically are exploring the major arcana. I believe it's 21 cards, and
What's a major arcana?
it's like the main. I'm very new to tarot, so I have a hard time explaining what the major arcana
Like the
is.
central tarot.
The central, the Fool's Journey is what it's called. I really don't think
It's a set of 21 tarot cards.
it's a set of 21 tarot cards that
That's all I know.
that's all I know too. That's why she's I have more of the drama therapy background, and our idea is it's for people who feel stuck or want to embrace their creativity a little more. And so by walking through different archetypes of these cards, we will do drama therapy activities, art therapy activities, talk therapy activities to kind of navigate and analyze ourselves and connect with group members through that. Yeah.
So people who are looking for some self-discovery and
Yeah.
feeling like they'd like to explore and develop more of a sense of purpose.
Yes.
This is a format to facilitate kind of that exploration
Mhm.
in community and in interaction with
Yes.
others in a group setting.
And it will be online as well.
Using drama therapy and art therapy.
Mhm.
Cool.
Yeah.
If you are feeling, I don't know, stuck or like you lack a sense of purpose, or at least don't have as strong of a sense of purpose as you would like, and are intrigued by the potential of exploring some of that, using some of the archetypes involved in tarot as a way to facilitate it, then that's what this is for.
Yeah. It's on Psychology Today. You can email Caitlin or myself. You can find our email addresses on the effectiveartistry.com page too. If you click on our names, that's a way to contact us as well, or via Psychology Today. I know
And it's a closed group,
Yeah.
right? So it's how many people?
a
A maximum of
8 to
Yeah.
10.
So a maximum of 10 people. So once those slots are full, anyone else who's interested will have to wait for a future instance of
Which
the
we
group.
plan on.
And it runs for how many weeks?
8.
So it's an 8-week long group starting in February. You'll get the details
Yeah.
if you look it up, but
It's Monday nights, 6 to
Monday
7:30.
every week for 8 weeks. Cool.
Yeah. We said our goal, me and Caitlin, for our Wednesday supervision, we do a group supervision with all the therapists here. And we're like, our goal for Wednesday is to be able to pitch it to the therapists here. So So this is good practice for me.
Yeah, just explain it to everybody.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, one of the things that why I've done the stream for so long is, we might have talked about it, or I might have talked about it on here or whatever, but to me, in order to help someone through communicating with them, which is like the point of therapy, two things have to be true. One is that you have to the things that you're communicating, the concepts, the information you're communicating to people have to be helpful to them in some way. And the other is that you have to be able to communicate them in such a way that the other person can access that information, which means being clear and speaking the same language, but also means getting people's attention.
Yeah. Talking on here very much makes me think of talking on a podcast when people cannot see what you're gesticulating to, and how you do have to be a little more detailed to give context to things.
Sure.
Yeah.
That I think generally, certainly myself, and I would say kind of broadly, those of us here at Effective Artistry tend to be people who have a lot more success historically with coming up with great ideas and knowing helpful things, and then need more work in being able to communicate those things to people in a way that is accessible and digestible. So I'm excited for.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I am too pithy with my responses, and I want to work on elaborating.
I mean, there was a day, I don't know, year and a half ago or whatever, where I was having fun coming up with all these spectrum. I guess spectra is the plural, is a way to identify or define certain terms as being a balancing point between two ends. So one I've talked about is that efficacy, being effective, efficacy is the balancing point between expediency and efficiency. That expediency is just what can we do right now, and efficiency is let's design a system that gets the best return on investment, but doing that is its own task. So being effective is balancing those two things. And when it comes to communication, the most effective communication is balancing point between brevity and clarity. They're like brevity and precision, I think, is what if you say way too much, then things get lost. But if you only say a couple words, it's not very precise and can get interpreted in many different ways.
What's the quote? Brevity is the blank of the soul.
Brevity is the soul of wit. I don't know who that's by, but it smacks of Oscar Wilde.
It smacks of Oscar Wilde to me too.
Yeah.
Smacks of Oscar Wilde.
I don't know.
It's a funny word choice to me.
Better than reeks of. Yeah, no, that is an interesting word choice. It's not like a common way of.
I was just like, sure, yeah.
Now you've got me wondering if that's something that's unique to me, that's not
I've never heard anyone say smacks of.
Has the flavor of, is in some ways reminiscent or suggestive of or sounds like. But now I'm wondering if that's not a common usage of that. I'll look it up later. But not on the stream because it'd be boring to watch me with something that probably.
I look things up all the time at gatherings, social gatherings. I need to know the answer right away. So you don't have to. That was not me convincing you. No. I'm just saying I'm that guy. I'm the guy at the bonfire who's like, hang on, what is that? Yeah, that's true. Smacks.
Oh, interesting. It does mean something seems to it contains elements of something, but apparently an unpleasant quality, specifically smacks of hypocrisy, smacks of paranoia, smacks of racism. I did not know because even that part in the definition is in parentheses, so I did not know the connotation of.
Will you be changing your language now?
Probably. Not intentionally. It's not something I use enough to even consciously think of, but that's how all thought and the ways in which thought guides action and experiences guide action is you become aware of something, you experience something, and it modifies to some extent the processes that are outside of conscious control that dictate what happens in the future.
This is true.
Certainly I wouldn't have said smacks of Oscar Wilde.
Oliver Twist.
Well, it's because I was thinking Olivia,
Yeah.
and I was like, no, not Olivia. But yeah. Well, no, but see, now here's a use. The smack of ají, a red chili, set off the freshness of each flavor. That's not unpleasant.
I just think of the action of a smack when I
It's
flare.
it's not that usage of smack. It's like smacking your lips. I think it's like taste.
Oh, interesting.
Now I'm gonna look up the etymology.
Remember when you said people don't watch me look up, and now you're looking up even more?
But etymology
I know.
is so interesting.
I love etymology too. I also didn't realize that efficacy was effective. Like that, I didn't put those two and two together.
The noun version.
Yeah.
Yeah, from the Old English, which is related to the Old High German smack, meaning taste. But the to strike comes from the Middle Dutch word smacken.
Mm.
Oh, and heroin is a slang term. Didn't even think about that. either.
Smack is.
Yeah, smack is a slang term for heroin.
Mm.
Probably not as like modern. Anyway, okay.
I had a thought. It fleeted. I did not know.
I think just since we're talking about
Please.
language, and I think that would be it fled. Something which is fleeting is something which is fleet.
And what did I
Like
do?
being fleet of foot. You said it fleeted.
It fleeted.
Uh,
Flew away.
or fled.
Fled.
But I could be wrong about that too.
Wow.
Language is
never know.
fascinating, particularly, and obviously I'm biased because this is the language I know, but particularly English is a fascinating language. I think there's a kind of somewhat famous description of the English language by Stephen Fry, and I'll badly misquote it and paraphrase it here, but he says something to the effect of like English is the language that goes around like knocking out other languages in back alleys and rifling through their pockets for anything that it finds of value.
Oh my god, yeah.
You know, that English is this like beautiful hodgepodge of just people stealing whatever they want to steal.
Have you seen the videos of people or like what English sounds like to other people? Yeah.
I have, and those are interesting.
I don't even know how that is like. How does one even know how to portray that?
Well, so we've talked about like attention, right? Like how much detail one picks up from something. Because paying attention to something is not a binary, like you notice it or don't notice it. Because anything can be broken down into constituent elements, right? And you can notice more and more and more of something. Even in the sense of like, if I look at a palette and it's just a bunch of things that I would call red, even though notably they're different shades and tones and whatever, to me, I'd still say like, that's a lot of red on that. Where someone else might break it down and say, no, there's crimson and scarlet and whatever, right? So you can take something, and if you conceptualize it as being composed of elements,
Yeah.
now noticing one thing, instead of one thing, you're thinking of 10 elements, and it takes up 10 times as much of your attention.
Oh, but that hurts because we were just saying it's a hodgepodge of all these other languages, and there's so many elements to other languages.
Well, sure. But what we're doing when we speak language, like we're using language here for the common and the dictionary meaning of a shared set of symbols. We're listening only to be able to interpret the language into meaning, like what do the words mean? There are some times and places where we're doing different things, but meaning when we're communicating, we're just listening closely enough to be able to match the sound we're hearing against a word that we know and believe the other person is using so that we can access the meaning there.
I want to talk about tone and speech.
Yeah.
And how sometimes people can get frustrated when, or here, I'll do me personally. Like, I have been talking with people who speak in a more monotone voice, and I've been confused about what they are saying, and they'll be like, it's just my voice. And I know sometimes that's a thing in the autistic community. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
Sure.
I mean, monotone is one word that gets used to describe this. Another is flat affect.
Yes.
But what we're talking about is an expression, an element of expression that does not vary from base very much, right? Like all people vary in what we call meta communication, like non-explicit communication, tone and speech and pace of speech and body language, but also context and etc. But like some people, in some cases, we would describe this as being very musical or having a very musical voice. But some people, when they speak, they go really high on certain emphasis and then they can bring it really down low.
Yes,
on
and I
other
feel
parts, and they
extra
very up
sensitive
and
to
down.
it from being a theater artist and a preschool teacher, of like being very playful with my voice. And so sometimes it surprises me when people don't have range. I'm like, oh, not everyone's a theater kid.
Well, so the point, I guess, of language or the utility of language as a tool is how modular it is, meaning you can modify words using other words so easily, but not only other words, there are other things you can do to modify, and like tone, pitch, rapidity, and we're talking not just about like high or low, but higher or lower than the previous syllable or whatever. How long you stretch something out. English is, from what I am given to understand, referred to as a stress-timed language rather than a syllable-timed language. So this is a very weak understanding that I'm realizing I should look more into. But my understanding of that is that we assign the amount of time given to a certain syllable in a word based on whether we're emphasizing that syllable. Where other languages like Spanish, for example, or French are syllable-timed languages where there's a default amount of time given to each one.
Japanese too, where like
unless there's a diacritic, accent mark, in which case that one. So you default to everything has the same amount unless you specifically call out, emphasize this, where English has emphasis built in, which can be anything that allows you to modify what you're saying makes it more complex to communicate and more rife for miscommunication.
Fascinating.
But also allows you to convey a greater variety of things with a smaller set of initial symbols. That the sentence that I was always used for an example with me is, I never said she stole my money. In English, if you emphasize
each word,
a different word,
acting exercise,
each time it means a different thing. Part of, I think, what is so interesting about English, but also, so again, everything has its costs and its value, right? Like its upsides and its downsides, and things which allow you to convey a wider variety of meanings has the upside of allowing you to communicate things with more nuance, or communicate things more briefly, and has the downside of increasing the chance of miscommunication, misinterpretation. Well, one of the things about English is that all English is spoken in unspoken comparison to that which is not said. So that sentence of, I never said she stole my money, the reason that the meaning changed, if I say, I never said she stole my money, I mean, somebody else said it, but I didn't say it. If I said, I never said she stole my money, I said someone stole my money, but not. So whatever we're emphasizing, we're saying, we're specifically calling that out in opposition to all the things that fit in that category, but are not that thing. So we convey a bunch of extra information that way. But it also means that English speakers are, by default, much more likely than to view everything as a comparison. As
a comparison to?
Well, depends on the context, but a very common version of this is a comparison to myself in some way I wouldn't want it to be. Like
what
a
I was
very
saying.
common thing of somebody being like, wow, that person's so attractive, and then the person I'm talking to being like, and what am I?
Sure.
Right? Like, that statement is a statement about that person as compared to
Something.
all others, which includes you, right? Or things like, oh, you're being so helpful can be interpreted as like, oh, and normally I'm
And normally
not.
you're not. Yeah.
So it allows for us to convey more information, but
So
it's right for
miscommunication.
miscommunication, and it inclines us in a certain direction where when we are expecting that there might be something negative that's being communicated in our direction, when we think that the other person might think some negative thing about us, it makes it so that like any positive statement about any other person can still be interpreted as a negative thing about us. Vice versa too, though, right? Like it can also be like, oh, look at those terrible people, and you can interpret that as like not like us, right? Like, I'm including you in that you and I are not terrible people like those terrible people.
Mm-hmm.
So it leads to a lot of us and them, and I actually think there are things about the structure of English that facilitated colonialism by English-speaking countries.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also true of Latin, although I know less about Latin, and then the descendant languages of Latin.
Do you want to say more?
Well, one way of talking about this way that English does just co-opt languages, like specific elements of language from other linguistic traditions, is you can view that as a version of colonialism, right? Like you observe something that exists and you evaluate what elements of that thing are useful to me, and I'm going to take those things for me, right? I don't know. A lot of this is just like theorizing and making some connections between things that I'm concerned would come across as like much more thought through and serious
Sure.
than it really is.
I guess why I brought it up is like, have you ever had clients talk about their voice or their affect of their voice, and like, what does that conversation look like? Of like, is it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so when it comes to flat affect, and again, hi, what's up? I don't like the phrase flat affect or monotone, because monotone is not literally true. It's not the same tone.
Right.
It varies, just
Tempo.
not as much as a person might be expecting or used to. Flat affect also is a comparative thing.
Sure.
It's saying this affect is flatter than the norm.
Sure.
But what we're talking about is a perception of a more limited variation in certain like metacommunicative behaviors, pitch, high to low, pace of speech, or certain like facial expressions or body language or whatever. Well, like with everything that we talk about, especially through the neurodiversity affirming lens, if I encounter a problem, right, like if I come to a door that is locked and I pick that lock and open it up, then the next time I come to a door that's locked, I'm just gonna be like, oh, when I encounter a locked door, I just pick it, and that's how I get through. Where if I come to a door and I kick it open, then the next time I come to a locked door, I'm gonna kick it open, right? If I come to a next door that's locked that I need to get through and I try picking it and that doesn't work, then I'll explore other options. But as long as it works, I'm going to keep using that, which over time means I'll get better and better and better at picking locks. And also means that I am not really paying much attention to other ways to open a locked door. This is just when you accept that humans are limited and that we have finite resources. Obviously, a big part of what we're talking about in terms of individual human variation is that we're each kind of optimizing our solutions to problems and trying to generalize, well, I solved this previous problem in this way, and that problem has similarities to this one, so I'm going to try that same way.
And so you're relating that to speech?
So the point of a wider variation would be to modify the information that I'm getting across, right? Like if I use tone heavily, then I can use a more narrow subset of vocabulary to convey a wider spread of information by modifying that vocabulary with tonal changes. like sarcasm as an example, a very egregious example that I can make the same statement mean two directly opposite. I could say, "You are so wonderful," in a certain tone that conveys
Right.
what we would literally associate with that, or I could say, "You are so wonderful," in a way that conveys the exact opposite, that I don't think you're wonderful. If I'm doing that, then I don't need to come up with a way to say like, "You are loathsome," because I'm expressing that
Sure.
idea by just saying the same
Loathsome
word.
is your opposite.
Wonderful.
It's so funny.
Terrible. I don't know.
I have issues with that word.
Oh, right. I forgot about that. So, the better someone is at a particular solution to a given set of problems,
Mhm.
the less they're going to pay attention to or develop the ability to solve that same set of problems in some other way. If the problem here is I'm trying to get my meaning across to somebody, there are multiple different ways to go about that. I think generally what you'll find with people that people would generally refer to as monotone or flat affect is that they rely on a wider vocabulary
Mhm.
and or more modifications, adding on more words and more phrases to clarify and be precise.
I'm thinking of people I know, I'm like, God damn, that's true.
I think that's part of why there's an association with what's called monotone or flat affect with what is diagnosed as or identified as autism. I think that also plays into what we call hyperliteralism, which is people's tendency, and autistic people have this tendency at a higher rate than non-autistic people. People's tendency to interpret meaning from a person's literal, explicit word choice
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to other things, right? That like, if I say, "Hey, will you get the laundry out of the dryer for me?" and you would go and get the laundry out of the dryer and just put it on top of the dryer, you've done literally what I asked you to do. And then if I come back and say, "Well, like I meant like,
Do
fold
laundry,
it
yeah.
and like put it away," that can be very frustrating because I'm expecting that someone else would have interpreted, the context, right? Like, how did you not know that putting the laundry on top of the dryer is just going to make it get wrinkled and whatever? But that's the point. I didn't stipulate that extra stuff explicitly because I didn't consider it as though it was like, to me, the phrase "will you get stuff out of the dryer" contained all that information.
This is so my relationship.
So obviously I am a person who relies on word choice, and the thing about explicit language is it's much more on that brevity and precision. It's much more precise. That's the benefit of explicit language, like
Good for
words.
you.
You can get much more precise.
Uh-huh.
It is not brief, it's the opposite. It takes longer because I'm using more and more words to modify everything I'm saying. Whereas tone and body language and those kinds of things go to the brief side because I can say fewer words and use these additional markers to modify the meaning,
Mhm.
but are less precise, take it away from precision because tone and body language and all of that is much more open to interpretation
Mhm.
than word choice. So the problem here when we're having these conversations generally is that people are being given this feedback through the deficit lens.
Yeah.
Meaning when someone is saying to you, "Hey, you're kind of monotone," or "You have a flat affect," they're being told that as though it's a problem.
Yeah.
Like, here's this thing that you do that is bad that inhibits your ability to communicate with other people, either to make yourself understood or to understand other people
Mhm.
accurately, like in the way that they intended.
Gotta sneeze.
Bless you. Which, yes, of course, anybody is likely to get either sad or prickly when
Right.
given that kind of feedback, where they're like, "Hey, there's this characteristic that varies among humans, but people do it more or less to some extent, and doing it less is bad, and you do it a lot less, and it's just about who you are, and there's nothing that can be done about it." Like, effectively, what you're saying to people when you're saying it in that way, through that lens, is other people don't understand you very well, and you don't understand other people very well, and that's how it's always been, and that's how it will always be, and there's nothing you can do about it, and it's because of how you communicate.
All from just saying one little sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you can approach this conversation more the way that I'm talking about, with that nuance and precision, talking about it through the lens of
Yeah.
there are upsides and there are downsides, that your method of communicating has these advantages and these disadvantages, or like in these contexts it can be beneficial and in these contexts it can be detrimental. Makes it a lot easier, because at the end of the day, does it cause problems? Yeah,
Mhm.
of course. Like we all have experiences, some of us more than others,
Mhm.
of like, ooh, that person thought I was really angry when I wasn't.
Mhm.
I mean, the concept of resting bitch face, which is another concept that I really don't like. Not because it doesn't accurately encapsulate this experience of like, people often think I'm judgy or angry when I'm not thinking or feeling that way, and I associate it with how they look at my face. And, you know, because people say, well, you look angry when I'm not angry. But calling it that, talking about it that way, again, it's like a thing you have or don't have, and there's nothing you can do about it, instead of taking it as, this is the way that people are interpreting the way that my face looks. And even if I can't change anything about that, even just being more aware of it
Yeah.
would modify how I'm expecting other people. The more aware I become of the
Yeah.
fact that people are going to interpret me as angry when I'm just pensive,
Mm.
then the more when I'm pensive, I'm going to put some thought or effort into being explicit about like, oh, I'm thinking about this, or like, you know, I'm not angry, or yes, modifying the way that my face looks, which brings us kind of back to masking, as we've talked about in the past. And people will push back on like, well, I shouldn't have to like do that, which it's not about have to or not. That's the deficit model. It's about communication. All communication is a matter of trying to get your point across to the other person. And if you learn a new word that might help you to communicate that point more effectively, you would use that. And if you learn a new way of holding your face that might get it across more effectively, then there's nothing wrong with using that. It's effortful, but that doesn't mean fake. Using a new word is also effortful. Playing a new video game is effortful. Like doing anything new and different is effortful. As you do it over time, it becomes less effortful. Is always worth it? No. And especially when it comes to tone and that kind of stuff, part of the reason that someone might not consciously necessarily choose, but over the years, why someone might go the path of trying to be explicit with language and not pay as much attention to that other stuff. For one, if I communicate via writing at a disproportionately high rate, then like word choice is going to be a much bigger deal than tone and affect and body language and
Just
whatever.
puzzle pieces that are happening in my head right now. I'm like, that connecting to this, that.
But one of the things that might kind of make me less able to modify that is if I believe that modifying that is not a possibility, or that it's something I shouldn't do. Well, sure, I could learn how to hold my face differently, but I shouldn't have to. Is a fine thing to believe.
Mhm.
But if you believe that, you're not going to be putting much resources towards like understanding and utilizing this tool as a way to communicate.
Mhm.
And again, one of the reasons you might not be as incentivized to do that is that it is more open to interpretation. So if you are somebody who interacts with people from a more broad, diverse array of people, you might rely less on those kinds of things that are more culturally bound, like tone and body language, and etc. You know, people think that body language is like implicit and inherent, but there are cultures in which nodding your head means no and shaking your head means yes. This is all learned behavior.
Mhm.
We just assume that it isn't because everybody we know interprets it in a certain kind of a way.
I'm like, yes, Brandon.
Yeah, so it's not a deficit, but in the same way that, like, if I was talking to someone playing a video game and they keep taking the stealth route to work their way around stuff, that I'd be like, hey, do you know that you can also just make a head-on attack, or do you know that you can also use
No, we're being
like,
stealthy every day.
do you know that you can also use like charisma and talk your way through to that objective? And if you already know that, do you consider that an option that's available to you to utilize and select to use the one that you're utilizing? Or is it something that you think of as like, you are not good at it, you wish you could do it, whatever. So, because yeah, there is all kinds of benefit, at least potentially, to working on developing my nonverbal vocabulary in a sense.
Yeah, and I think I have probably placed a higher value on it because of, I don't know, XYZ in my background.
I think a really, really common dynamic. Are you proficient in the persuasion skill? Then you can add your proficiency modifier. Always proficient.
I would be so scared to play D&D with you, unless you were the DM.
I usually am. I don't know when you'd be scared though.
I don't know why either. Maybe if
I'm
I was
scared of it.
if I was the DM and you were playing, I'd be scared.
That's okay. Fair enough. Yes, this should be approached as a skill, not as a characteristic.
Yeah.
As with most of these things. I feel like Brandon will make a great DM. I am a great DM.
Oh, absolutely.
Problem is,
It's what attracted me to this place is in your bio. When I read that, I'm like, yes.
to DM in the way that I do requires a lot of like time and energy. So when I don't have that available, I just don't do it.
Yeah.
And that's why I haven't been doing it for years. But yeah, when I'm dedicated to it, for sure, I'll brag about it. I'm a great DM. I, of course, being who I am, at some point like analyze the different elements of what goes into DMing because it's a broad skill set, and generally each person like has one of those skills as their kind of point of emphasis and just has to learn the rest and fill in the gaps. But a lot of them are things that like
You have all of them.
not have all of them, but like one of the things, for example, is acting. You know, like literally using your voice and jumping into the character, modifying your voice and improving for role play, which is a thing that I enjoy. I'm really good at dialects and modifying my voice.
Your
and
favorite
whatever.
dialect?
Huh?
A favorite dialect?
I don't know that I have a favorite, but certainly, like if I have to come up with something real quick, generally it will be some version of like UK.
Everyone submit a drawing of your own. We'll have Brandon give voices to them next week.
Or because I have a lot more information about,
Mhm.
like I can do a lot more different types of UK accents,
Mhm.
and also like players, at least the players that I play with, generally have more. If you're trying to convey something about a character, for example, talking about conveying things, having like a Cockney accent is going to convey to people a connotation of like poverty and crassness.
Mhm.
And using British RP is going to convey this sense of like propriety and decorum, whatever.
Oh, same. I technically like DMing, but I put so much effort into it, it becomes stressful.
Yeah. I feel like I can't present an encounter unless I know why it's happening, how it's connected to the bigger story, loot they could get, 3 ways to make the standard goblins more interesting, and options for if the grave player decides to talk to the dead bodies. Yeah, I am not that kind of DM. That's a lot of preparation, which is great, but I'm much more of an improver.
That makes sense to me.
Co-creating. I do preparation, but not to that extent. Like,
Yeah.
certainly, like when there's encounters, I'll do more about like
Mhm.
especially when I'm doing things that are like puzzle or lore oriented and whatever.
Do you make your own
World?
not world? I'm thinking of you giving a card of like, you got this item, and you
Oh,
made up
sure.
the item.
Yeah, because that's another one of the skill sets that's common for DMs is like the world building skill set. A lot of DMs are just super into like building this environment, and then the other stuff comes along.
Mhm.
Another one is like narrative construction. A lot of DMs are basically writers that like to write stories, fleshing out arcs and whatever. Another one is the mechanics knowledge, like knowing the game and understanding it as a set of mechanics. Yeah, I like all that stuff. Another one is, I think, not paid attention to as much. It's like the soft skills, the running of a group event, facilitating 5 to 8 people sitting around a table and everyone enjoying themselves.
Catering to each person.
Yeah, making sure that everyone's getting engaged in whatever extent. I give my players inspiration if they make me laugh, and I made little origami stars with quotes on them, so when they use the inspiration, they can open the star for the quote.
Oh, that's so sweet.
That is very cool.
It makes me think. I have a presentation for tomorrow, and I went way above and beyond on the thing that I'm making. And just Brandon was saying, like, that's a lot of effort for something that's going to be 10 minutes long. But the value of it was so, like, it was so high for me because it made me feel so good. And, like, I'll probably use it as decoration. The thing I'm making, it's a giant gumball machine, by the way. Like, it'll be decoration. It was
It's a
fun.
giant facsimile of a gumball machine, not an actual gumball.
Right. And I made it out of ball pit balls and a clear balloon. But it doesn't matter how much effort was put in there, the value was so, so great for me.
Well, that's the thing. It's you got to evaluate when we talk about cost and value.
Mhm.
It is fine for the value to be like, I enjoy the experience of doing it, or
Yeah.
I feel as though I've created something really cool. Where you get in trouble is when the value is around, like, I'm imagining how people respond to
Sure,
this.
sure.
Like, I see this a lot with my wife in baking, for example. She
Mhm.
loves to bake certain kinds of desserts. I mean, she likes to cook a lot of different things generally, but baking is her big
Mhm.
thing. And it's very much like she enjoys the act of it, certainly. But part of what she enjoys about it is having a product to present to people that they enjoy. And so seeing people's responses to it is a big deal.
And that's a part of mine for sure, but it's not the majority.
Yeah.
The-
And they will think it's super cool, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
But it's
I
also
know.
a class assignment. That was what I was pointing out is I wasn't trying to discourage you before you made it. I didn't say any of this before you made it. But just that, like, you know, people were going to, my guess is people will be like, that's so cool and it's awesome. And then we do something with it for 10 or 15 minutes and then we move on because it's a class project.
And then the next person brings their creative thing. That's me playing the guitar.
Right. But now I'm running out of quotes. Plus, I get hung up on making sure a quote is attributed correctly because I hate repeating quotes that are wrongly attributed. So I spend a lot of time on Quote Investigator. That's funny.
What's Quote Investigator?
I am using context to deduce that it is a website that allows you to, like, find out who really said something.
That's funny.
But that takes up more time and sometimes means I can't use a quote. Again, there's that phrase, context is king, because I also care a lot about correct attribution. But it depends, right? Like when you're sitting around talking with friends, it's, to me, I'm happy to be like, I think it might be this person, but I don't know. Or sometimes,
I'm having trouble. What do you mean correct attribution?
like saying who the
Who it
quote,
belongs
yeah,
to? Okay.
like attributing that quote to the person who said it.
Gotcha.
Uh,
It's a blog thing by a guy who wrote a book called Hemingway Didn't Say That.
I will frequently, well, maybe not frequently, but I'll sometimes say things like, you know, there's that quote that everyone always attributes to Einstein that I'm positive isn't him, but, and then say it because I don't know who it's from. But that specific one is, everyone attributes this quote about if you judge a fish's intelligence by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend its life thinking it is stupid, which people attribute to Einstein. I think gets so many quotes attributed to him that are not him because of how our culture worships intelligence, and he's become the, like,
He does.
in the way that, like, Apollo was the Greek god of the sun, Einstein is our culture's god of intelligence.
Right.
The avatar that represents the paragon of the ideal.
I mean, my brother, for his letter to Caltech, he started with an Einstein quote, which is, pick me, pick me. I think of that often.
Real pick me energy.
He got in, but didn't go.
We were saying something before.
My
this.
local coffee shop that I love down the street from my work has a quote. Filling up a whole wall that's incorrectly attributed to Abraham Lincoln. Oh, that's so frustrating.
Yeah, that's funny. I like the is it the, it bothers me. Is it the one, I hear this one attributed to Lincoln, and again, I'm like 99%, I looked it up at one point, I'm almost certain that it's not him, but I guess I could be misremembering of, it is better to keep your mouth closed and let everyone assume that you are a fool than to open it and remove all doubt. It's attributed to him. The other one that gets attributed to him that I like a lot is, you can find anything on the internet, Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, we've seen that.
Just to make the point here. But also, again, it depends on why you're doing it, right?
Mhm.
Like, if attribution is about giving credit, right? And Einstein don't give a crap if you give him credit or not, right? So when we're talking about like if I'm writing a blog or putting something out there that might be beneficial to me or to people, then it's important that we cite things correctly and don't just claim or act as though we made something up when we didn't. If what you gave me last was tea, I want coffee. If it was coffee, I want
Oh my
tea.
God, are they actually doing that and quoting Abraham Lincoln?
I think that's the one that's on the wall.
I hope so.
Which also seems like an insult to the coffee shop. It is funny though. It is funny. It does seem like a strange quote
Goodness.
for a coffee shop.
Unless they have like books or they're like.
Well, I just mean because like the point of that quote is that
They want tea.
I don't want the same thing over and over, and it seems to me that a coffee shop's business model is like we are your coffee shop. You come to us
Well,
every day. You
they
might
said
get different things.
there's multiple quotes though, so there could be one that contradicts that.
Oh, I didn't read
No,
it.
they didn't provide any, but they said that they're
It
quotes.
says has it a quote.
Oh,
filling
a
up
quote.
A
I thought
whole
it was-
wall.
Oh, filling the whole, not a whole wall of quotes.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But yeah, like if my business model is based on like you have a habit of coming here, then why would I want to emphasize that? Anyway, one I think is to say I can't tell if the thing you gave me is tea or coffee, but it's terrible, so give me the opposite.
It's
It,
like seems bad.
Yeah. Honestly, it just seems like someone. My guess would be that someone just wanted a quote on the wall, and probably has more than one, and they just want quotes that contain the word coffee in it, and literally just like Googled like
A failure of
Quotes
chat
with-
GPT.
quotes that say something about coffee, and that showed up, and they didn't really think that much about it. Just that it's kind of funny and whatever.
That's frustrating. For someone who loves interior design and someone didn't think too much about it and just went to Google, that breaks me a little.
Quote investigator attributes it to a distinguished citizen of North Carolina.
Distinguished.
That sounds to me like it would have been from like a letter to the editor that was published in a newspaper with the name given of distinguished citizen of North
I
Carolina.
wonder if you're on quote investigator.
Me?
Yeah. You
Definitely
say
not.
so many things.
I do, but not nobody, but not it's none of the things I say are well known. or-
Distinguished citizen of North Carolina, Brandon Tessers. Which one's more specific?
I'm just saying no, there are not many people who would quote me, even though I say many quotable things.
Watch us.
There are some. It's a relatively small group of people. Anyway,
Someone was asking me, one of the other therapists here, Ozzy was like, "What's your style here?" I was like, "Well, like I feel existential in a lot of ways. I'm also sometimes a mini Brandon." And I was asking like, "What about you?" And he's like, "I'm this and that," and also yeah, sometimes a mini Brandon. That's not really.
I genuinely that response was joking. I appreciate that statement. I think each of you, if anybody were to say like, what exactly does that mean, would say different things.
Sure, that's
So
absolutely true.
it's really just a way of saying that you like and respect like
Yes,
a lot of the things that I have taught you, and you try
Take
to
things
use
from
some
you,
of the
yeah.
things that I've taught you.
that's true though. I should have asked specifically what he meant.
But it's different things for different people.
Yeah, that's funny.
You are correct. It appeared in January 1840 in the Madison Courier of Madison, Indiana. Why is a North Carolinian writing in letters to an Indiana paper? Anyway,
Where else are you gonna write a letter to?
this is like a lot of this goes into that same thing that I talk about a lot. Of like, people just care way too much about being correct, being accurate, as opposed to being useful, right? Like, when I'm sharing a quote with my buddy, it doesn't really matter who I attribute that to.
Or if it was on Wednesday or Thursday in the
Right.
story. Oh, that drives me crazy.
Well, generally, like attribution of quotes specifically, right? There's two different things that would make somebody want to attribute a quote, and I think this is why they get misattributed so much in the way that they do. One is trying to give credit to the source, right? Like, I don't want to give the impression, I'm not trying to claim that I came up with this. I am acknowledging that I got this idea from someone else to credit them. The other is the appeal to authority fallacy, that because of who said this, you should listen to it more.
Mhm.
And when you're doing it for that reason, when you're using a quote to make a point to somebody and just trying to get them to listen to and respect and agree with the concept, then who you attribute it to is entirely dependent on who you think would most likely get that person to be like, oh, they said that? Okay, well, I guess that's a good point then.
This is funny. I'm doing a group project on a case of Mo, the bartender from The Simpsons.
Yeah.
And I've been watching episodes of The Simpsons, and there was the episode of the Flaming Mo, where Homer introduces this new drink concoction to Mo because he's out of beer, and then he's like, I call it the Flaming Homer, and then someone's like, Mo, what's this drink? He's like, it's the Flaming Mo, and then like he gets all this money from it, and it's all attributed to him, and it all goes haywire. But it's kind of that idea.
Yeah, mostly like proper citation is important in for crediting someone when you're talking about something that makes money or gains prestige or has some tangible benefit to it. Then yes, not properly quoting or citing someone is underhanded. You know?
Right.
But in casual conversation,
Who cares?
even just by saying there's a quote without saying who it's
For
from,
sure,
I'm
yeah.
already accomplishing the thing of being like, this
I didn't
isn't
say this.
me saying it, even though I'm not sure who was.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I also don't want to give the impression that leads people, although sometimes certainly, but generally it's not like, I'm going to use this quote and I'm going to lie to this person and say their favorite rock star said it in order to make them listen to it.
Right.
But it's more that like, in talking to someone, the process is where I'm like referencing, where an idea comes up of like, oh, this quote might be of interest to this person, is filtering through like, who is somebody that this person might think is worth listening to.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever I pull up is going to be somebody that I think they would listen to. And it only takes one person or two people or whatever, especially the older the quote is, to just say, like, to make a deliberate choice of being like, I'm going to say this is Einstein, and then everybody thinks it's Einstein.
I think this is very funny that this came from me asking about brevity is the width of soul.
The soul of wit.
I'm gonna mess it up every time.
See, I would be fine with that. What annoys me is when someone states officially, this was said specifically by Abraham Lincoln, and it wasn't. I don't like being told things that are wrong. Yes, well, I agree with you in terms of like, if I'm going to put something on the wall in a public space.
Also, have a funnier joke.
that's
That's the best
not
thing. It's
very
not
funny.
funny.
The quote I would put it on the wall of a coffee house, but this is through my lens of what
Okay.
coffee shops are.
Go ahead, Brendan.
Is from Oscar Wilde. I spent all morning putting in a comma and all afternoon taking it back out again.
At a coffee shop?
Again, through my lens of what a coffee shop is, I don't drink coffee. I drink tea. But I think of it as like people go there and they work on their laptops and whatever, that like, to me, that's a much funnier thing of like, yeah, you keep working on your novel. Don't worry about it. While also being a little tongue in cheek.
It's very endearing.
It was a response to somebody who was criticizing artists, like at a dinner party or whatever. Somebody was being like, artists don't do nothing, whatever. Like you, Oscar, what did you do all day? It's like, I spent all morning putting in a comma and all that.
He actually say this? I mean, how do you know?
I don't, yeah, I guess it could be apocryphal, but I looked it up enough to like see that it is attributed to him.
Do you know I used to be obsessed with Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson?
Really?
Oh yeah.
I was gonna say simplify.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I went to Walden Pond. I had like a Thoreau ring and sweatshirt. I love the Transcendentalism unit.
I love transcendentalists. I, in many ways, think of myself as a transcendentalist, or at least adhere to many of the like philosophies of transcendentalists. Yes, I quote. I used to quote Thoreau a lot more than Emerson.
You
but
quoted Emerson, I think, recently. That's why I thought of it.
Emerson gets quoted, I think, more generally than Thoreau.
Yeah, my dog's
does.
name is Emmy.
And yes, especially when talking about this idea of like, it's not about accuracy, it's about utility. I don't care if the thing I'm saying is like inaccurate, if it's useful. And if it's accurate but unuseful, then who cares? Like if I'm saying something accurately, but it still I know it's going to be interpreted differently than I'm intending for it by saying it accurately, then like, which one am I going to sacrifice? But really, it's just about like, anything can be described in different ways, and anything can be described in any number of ways, all of which could be accurate. One accurate way to define or describe or discuss something does not preclude any other way from being accurate, like, which is part of how especially English speakers tend to view it, is like one thing is accurate and any other way of talking about the same thing is inaccurate. Like why questions, for example. I'm doing this because of my abandonment issues. And then if someone else says, well, you're also doing it because like that person didn't respond to you for 2 days. And they'll be like, yeah, but I only did that because of my, like, no, multiple things can be true. And language is a tool. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that people treat this stuff as though it's all about knowledge and information rather than utility. All ideas, communication, cognition, that's why everyone's focused on accuracy. It's like, if I have the correct knowledge or if I have the correct information, then I will succeed at anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what this is all about. It's if I have the stuff that will allow me to succeed at something, I have the stuff that will allow me to succeed at something. Whether that stuff is accurate or not is not the relevant issue. It's whether it is useful. And so people have a tendency in our culture to focus in more on accuracy than utility. It becomes pedantic, I do often make suggestions or comments on people's use of language. I know that this is a thing I'm known for. And because generally in our culture, our concept of someone who talks about other people's use of language and makes suggestions about how to use it differently is associated with that pedantic person who's just saying, you're wrong about a thing. Let me point out how you're wrong so that, we all know that I'm better than you. Sometimes what I do gets interpreted through that lens. Although usually in the actual experience of it, nobody thinks of it that way. But then still when they walk away, their concept of me is that I'm a language pedant. Even though
Pedant?
someone who's pedantic. Which in this case means like being overly focused on on accurate usage and critical of any inaccurate
And you
usage
do not.
for no purpose other than to be accurate. The kind of person that's like, well, technically it's 10 items or fewer, not 10 items or less, because that serves no function. And so that's like, I use language. One of my favorite Emerson quotes. Do I contradict? Again, in response to somebody who was trying to debate with him and pointed out that he was contradicting himself, said, do I contradict myself? Then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. That I'm going to say things in language that is, I am deeming to be the most useful way to get across whatever I'm trying to get across to this person. And in a different scenario, I'm going to say things in different language. And if anyone were to take those two different instances and put them next to each other, they'd say like, well, see, these are two opposite things. And sometimes that's even the case. Sometimes opposite things like are relevant in different places. Sometimes actually, no, it's in both cases I was expressing the same thing, or in both cases I was expressing completely unrelated, not opposed, just unrelated things, but using language that can appear to be related and opposed. People treat knowledge in our culture, intelligence, knowledge, information, as like a status symbol. The more you have of it, the better you are. And so it plays that role. Like people who use jargon and large terminology, obscure words and whatever, so that it's clear to everyone, look how much information I have, and you should think I'm cool, and you don't have those same things. So I might even deliberately, if not necessarily consciously, intentionally, I will still knowingly know this about myself and do use words that I specifically don't think you'll know in order to make it clear to you that I know stuff you don't know. And then so everybody ends up with this terrible view of what jargon is. Like, oh, this person's always just using $10 words trying to show off, because people do that. But those words exist for a reason.
Right.
They're very useful in very niche ways. And yes, using it outside of that community, you can do unintentionally, just forgetting to take into consideration that like not everybody knows these therapy terms, but I spend so much time talking to therapists and whatever that it's just part of my speech and I forget.
Or you can intentionally use terms like that to make the point to people like, I know stuff you don't know. And you can do that in different ways too, right? Like there are times where you're trying to make a point to somebody, I know some stuff you don't know, as a way to get their attention, even as an offer, like, look, I can help you with this. But sometimes you're doing it as a way of being like, I'm better than you and you suck.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're doing it one way and it gets interpreted the other, or you're doing it unknowingly and it gets.
I feel it happened so unknowingly when I was acting more and like taking on attributes from the characters I was playing and using language that they used. And there are still some plays where I'll say, there's Almost Maine, that classic play Almost Maine, and they say Jesus Crow instead of Jesus Christ. And I say Jesus Crow. And it's just like no one knows that except for a very small community of people who are aware of that play.
I actually think that's, to me, I think part of the reason that like those kinds of phrases persist
Yeah.
is because the specific language doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because the way in which these are exclamations, right?
Uh-huh.
And the context in which you use them and the tone and whatever conveys the point.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether you say Christ on a cracker or
Right.
Jeezle Pete or whatever. And so it allows for this kind of variation, both like culturally and regionally, but also personally. You know, like I like to say sometimes what the devil. And,
Yeah.
You know,
There were choir songs where we did like oi yitty doy, and like sometimes I'll say that instead of like oh my god, like oi yitty doy.
a lot of this language, right? Like a lot of linguistic expression is not about the word choice. It's about the tone and the context and whatever other things, and it doesn't matter. And a lot of linguistic expression is very much about the specific words that you're using. And we're all doing our best to try and navigate like which is which and when it's important to ask for clarification and when you can just kind of get it by the context.
Oh, Sondheim, I picked up a lot of phrases from my friend who constantly quotes Sondheim in reaction to things. Sondheim is so easy to quote too. It's just
Well, so I mentioned before, there are times where we're paying attention to more than just getting enough auditory information to figure out what the word is that someone's saying. One of those times is in singing.
hard to translate.
Going to translate. One of those times is in singing, where we're paying attention to the pitch and the tempo and the tone and whatever, because same with like whenever we're reading poetry or whatever, where the musicality of the language, the mouth feel of it, you know, the sensory
smack of it.
experience, the sensory experience of the language is part of the point. Also, though, one of the things that does that is when we are speaking to someone whose accent is different, meaning when we're talking about accents, we're talking about they use the same words, but they use different sounds to represent those same words in a pattern that is translatable when you learn it. So at first, when you're speaking to someone with an accent, you're paying a lot of attention, maybe even consciously being, what was that? And then something clicks for you. Like I remember talking to somebody recently, I believe, who is Polish American or Polish immigrant, I don't know how they would identify, who kept saying this word prosen. And I was like, what is that
Person?
word? Prosen. And eventually it clicked for me that it was percent. Percent was percent. And as soon as I made that connection, I no longer heard percent anymore. I just heard percent every time. This is part of the reason that people, in the same way I was talking about, like I could see a bunch of reds and notice there's different tones and whatever in it, but without language to apply to it, I can't replicate that or remember that. Same with accents, that when you're hearing someone speak with an accent that's different from yours, you notice it, you know there's a difference. But once it's done, if you don't have specific like intellectual, like cognitive abstract representation to attach to the variation there, you can't really remember and replicate it. Or if you do, you can only do it by mimicking specific things that you heard and not like applying it, which is part of what's so interesting to me about dialect work. I've learned to translate. Sometimes I'll make a Sondheim reference and he's like, oh, you've seen that play? No, I've just heard you quote it 20 times and picked it up. Honestly, some of the time.
That's me with video games with my boyfriend. I'm like saying all this stuff. He's like, you play? I'm like, no, just heard you talk about it a lot.
Whether intentional or not, one of the functions that this serves is kind of like wearing a t-shirt with your favorite band on it, that if somebody else sees that, they're like, hey, you and I have something in common.
Yeah.
So
I'm not going to wear a band shirt that I don't know the band of. No way, Jose.
linguistically, if you use a phrase or reference something
Like that's a big way that we are signaling to one another that we might share interests, even if that's not why we're intentionally doing it. But if
Mhm.
I'm trying to think, like the first reference that pops in my mind is that sometimes when I wake up in the morning, if my wife has gotten up 1st
Mhm.
with the boys, when I come out, I'll go, "Morning's here, the morning's here," which is a reference to a very specific episode of Friends. Which, like, you do that with somebody who doesn't know that, they'll be like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I have so many with my family like that. Where it's like no one else. It's-
Because the information we convey in spoken language is not necessarily about the words that we're using. The context shifts that. Sometimes the word itself has nothing to do with it, but we're using a word as a quote or a reference to something. Like emojis and GIFs are like the visual version of this,
Mhm.
where like it doesn't matter the original context anymore. This conveys a concept to me because it's been encoded that way.
We made like a video of my cousins and I when we were little, and we called it Annoying Siblings. And there's a little clip of my little sister Lily eating a chip with my cousin, and she didn't know what to say, and she goes, "I eat my chip." And now, whenever any of us family members feel awkward, we go, "I eat my chip," and it's so funny that just like it is just now part of our language. I think we have it on a coffee cup actually. Like,
Yeah, we whenever we're singing the song from Frozen,
Yeah.
the Let It Go,
mhm.
when we get to the part of like turn away and slam the door, because of like one specific video of my niece when she was 3, like really emphasizing door. I freaked out at the cashier in Barcelona once because the lady told me I owed €2, which sounded like 12 euros, and it took me 30 seconds staring blankly at her face to realize she was pronouncing the E and euro separately. Yeah, that's one of those things about syllable time languages, is that they, I'm sure that there are exceptions to this, and I'm just not enough of like an expert on this to know. So simplifying, but in most like general cases, where in Spanish, there's not short and long vowel sounds. Like each vowel is associated with a specific word, a specific sound, and every time you see that vowel, that sound happens, including in what are called digraphs in English, which is when we use 2 letters to represent one sound. They don't do digraphs in the same way for vowels.
How did I ever learn English? Sometimes I think about it. Blows my
Yeah,
mind.
that's part of what I was referring to earlier with like the role that English plays in colonialism, is that it is such a difficult language. Now, obviously, there are many languages which are difficult to master if you're not a native speaker, but English is very much one of those. And it relies so much on context and nuance and
Yeah.
cultural things that like if you don't grow up speaking English, like learning it in the context of being a member of that culture,
Spanish.
you'll never be able to pass it as that. And so if people are looking to identify, categorize people based on whether they are native speakers or not. So there's 12 euro or 2 euros instead of 12 euros. 12 euros.
Spanish is pronounced the same as Japanese, just with accents and such. I thought that was such a cool thing to learn. My brother's learning Japanese right now, and it's my brain when he shows me the books and the symbols and like, oh my gosh.
Japanese, I like Japanese. I know a decent amount about like a handful of languages, and then a little bit about a wider number, and then so many languages I know nothing about, obviously, but which is important. They have the same vowel sounds, which is unfortunate when I'm trying to keep the vocab separate. Yeah. Part of that is because Japanese is written in a different alphabet than English. So when we're transcribing Japanese words, like the sounds, Japanese sounds, into the, I don't know actually what the technical name of our alphabet is.
I don't know, but I know the Spanish alphabet. Not the name of it, just.
Well, me too, and the songs.
And, they say
with
it.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know.
Is there a name to the Japanese alphabet other than?
There Well,
There's three.
there's two alphabets. I'm speaking out of turn here, so I'll just say what I'm saying. I think that an alphabet is something which represents like phonetic, you know, like it represents sounds rather than concepts.
Right, like the International Phonetic Alphabet.
Right. Like English, the alphabet we use in English, each symbol represents a sound, not a concept.
Sure.
And then there are other forms of written language that represent concepts with images,
Sure.
not sounds. So Japanese
Interesting.
uses that also. That's called kanji.
Right.
And then they have hiragana and katakana, which are two different phonetic alphabets.
Yeah.
I could have sworn the Spanish word for umbrella was casa and not paragus. Yeah. Actually, when I was first learning Japanese, I learned, so the word for bread in Japanese is pan, P-A-N, which is the same as in Spanish.
Mhm.
And I was like, what? Like, they have the same word. Like, I was like, this is crazy that like
What?
people on all different places keep coming up with the same. And it wasn't until later that I learned that like, no, bread was introduced to Japan by Portuguese,
It's funny.
merchants or whatever. It's like, oh, that makes a lot more
Must
sense. Yeah. Actually, that's why there's hiragana and katakana that both are phonetic alphabets. One is used for native Japanese words.
Mm.
One is used for loan words that have come in from
Oh yes, I think I knew this.
other languages like Pam,
That's so beautiful.
which is so like,
We would have a lot of alphabets then if that was the case. I feel like.
well, like that's the thing is different cultures and like they care different ways about maintaining their language. Like French is notorious for being very careful before allowing a word to become an official French word. Obviously, Japanese puts an emphasis on separating our words versus words we got from other people. English don't give a crap. I mean, like, even the fact that if you try to break down English words etymologically, you know, Roman and Greek origins are going to be the two most common, but like, we take stuff from all over the place.
Mhm.
And even if we were only looking at the two most common, it's still a language that's built primarily on top of two other different languages. And Germanic is in there almost as much. Part of the reason, by the way, this is a fun little factoid that I like of why some of our words, I always compare katakana to cursive. Obviously not exactly the same, but kind of used similarly. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I always thought of cursive as being a utilitarian thing. Just
Right. Yeah.
when you're writing by hand, being able to use cursive is so much faster and more efficient. And part of the reason it's falling out. And I know traditionalists love to complain about cursive falling out of style.
My signature looks different on everything I've signed.
It doesn't serve the same function as it used to. We
No.
don't. It matters a lot more when you're going to write 10-page letters that you be able to write in this flowy, easy. But the thing about cursive is that like the whole idea of it is that it is the lower effort way of writing. So you would think traditionalists would be like, no, print is better, not the lazy swooshy blah 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 blah. But it's because so much writing was done in cursive because of how much easier it is. It became kind of aesthetic, and like now we think of it as beautiful in the same way that like calligraphy in many other cultures is. And so it's like this art form and whatever. It's just really wrapped up. Here's a little fact that I was going to share. Some of the curse words in our language are curse words because there was a period of time. Part of why English is so like all over the place is because England was this tiny little island country that kept getting invaded and taken over by different people. And so like the languages would get installed there and then mixed in with the next one and whatever. And there was a period of time where the populace spoke an English that was based on like German, Proto-Germanic language. But the ruling class spoke Latin, like Roman. And so the Latin Roman language was the fancy, like rich people, ruling class people spoke that. And the like general population spoke the German. And so there are a lot of words in English that we have two different words to mean the same thing. And the Latin one is the fancy one. and the German one is the crass one,
i.e.
i.e. copulate is the Latin word for having sex.
Mhm.
The F word is the Germanic one.
There we go.
Defecate versus the S word.
Mhm.
Not all curses come this way, obviously, like a lot have religious origin or whatever. But to this day, using Latin origin words conveys a sense of like erudition, you know,
Right.
being fancy and learned.
Learned. The ed.
A lot of this stuff, I mean, really, so many things just boil down eventually to like who had the power at some point to install something, and then we just pass it down by tradition. At that point. Anyway, we've ranged very far, all over the place, mostly on language. It's also hard to curse if you have to say defecation. Well, a lot of this is like at the root of it about how languages modify things. Like German, modern German, is famous for just smushing more and more and more words together to like come up with a new word. It's just like 4 other words just
Right.
compounded into one.
Smorgasbord.
I don't know if that one was German. I don't know. The one that comes to my mind is very actor
What
oriented.
is it?
The Fremdungseffekt.
Unfamiliar.
It's the Brechtian concept, the alienation effect.
Oh,
The German word is Befremdungseffekt.
how lovely.
So whereas like Latin famously involves so much different like conjugation
Mhm.
in order to like modify the meaning of what's being said.
I'm thinking about the Shakespeare Festival I did and how inside our concessions room we had just all of the words that he made up on the wall that are now words because of him.
That's the point. That's part of the reason that being pedantic about language is foolish. Language is a living thing. It's changing. For anybody to try and say like this is the correct usage and any other usage is incorrect, like okay, except the point of language is to be understood. And if you insist on saying, as people probably did for some period of time, cool is a reference to the temperature that something has.
Your
not-
son say drip or something about his outfit?
Fit.
Fit?
Uh,
How's
Drip. no, I think he did say, yeah, come get your drip to one of his friends. Yes, language is a living thing. The rule in linguistics
Mhm.
about incorrect usage is if a native speaker says it, it is correct usage. Because by definition, what linguistics is exploring is correct, incorrect. The only way to theoretically be incorrect is if you are trying to learn a language and do it differently than the people who already speak that language. That
What
would
if
be
what if we say like older generations trying to say the slang and lingo of younger generations and they're trying to use it and they're using it in the correct context, but it's
correct? Well, so for practical purposes, we can say correct and incorrect usage
Okay.
differently than what linguistics are talking about.
Okay.
The linguists are talking about. Because by that, what we mean is, are you using it in the way that I or that most people
Mhm.
would interpret it? Yeah, language is one place where I restrain my pedantry. I mean, honestly, like again, we were just talking about French and Japanese and other places that try to maintain kind of a linguistic, I mean, you can call it purity, I suppose that has a certain connotation, but like keeping it from varying too much over time. Well, English did the same thing, American English specifically, and this is one of the, English isn't real anyway. This is one of those things that to me, I think is like really important and meaningful, but when I express it, I think people just are like, oh, that's kind of an interesting factoid. The idea of the dictionary
Mhm.
is not like an inherent concept, right? Like people didn't develop language by writing down a book where they say what words mean.
Mhm.
Dictionaries are and always have been written by observing the language that is used
Mhm.
and transposing that into a written form. Well, Daniel Webster was an early American who specifically making an English dictionary like his life's purpose or whatever, because he was trying to prevent linguistic drift. His concern, as so many of the early American like important, rich white landowning men were, like he was very focused on how do we create a country that like maintains a solid, core country identity while allowing for differentiation in region and state and whatever.
Avoiding linguistic drift.
Linguistic drift meaning what happened, like the reason that even though England is a tiny, tiny little area, that it has so many easily identifiable and replicable accents is because like you'll go from one town to another town 10 minutes drive away and there's a whole different accent.
Mm-hmm.
Because prior to like modern methods of transportation, people did not cross-pollinate very much.
Right.
Like you grew up in that town. And so even though the people who would originally settle an area spoke the same language of someplace they came from, over the years, language is a living thing. It just starts to drift. There's the famous story, and I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but there's a famous story that the reason that people from Spain, Spaniards, pronounce S's with a lisp.
My family.
Is the story I've heard is because at a certain point the king had a lisp, and that then kind of proliferated as like the proper way of pronouncing things.
Interesting.
I don't know if that's actually true or just kind of a.
I like
story.
it. I want to see what this podcast is.
Highly recommend Lingthusiasm podcast for people who are enthusiastic about doing linguistics. So linguistic drift is just to describe the fact that like if you take two people who speak the same language and separate them, and then like over time and over the generations, like their language
Won't.
it shifts, it changes, it doesn't stay the same as one another because language evolves.
But he was
and they
making the
evolve in
dictionary
separate ways.
to try and avoid that?
Yes.
Buddy,
So-
it's inevitable.
Yes, but if you use the dictionary, only if the dictionary is considered to be the arbiter, the way of knowing what is correct or incorrect usage, that's a way to contain linguistic drift or to ostracize, like how much people talk about ain't isn't a word, when obviously it is written, it's used as a word, like it has a clear meaning. There's no definition of the word that ain't doesn't, except that it just wasn't in the dictionary. It is now, I believe, but
Yeah, I
it
think
wasn't
it
for a long
is.
time. And it served the purpose of being able to say, like, using ain't signifies that a person is of low class, and in particular, being from the American South is in many ways associated with being low class or stupid or ignorant, or your opinion is not as valid or worth listening to. So, not that I'm saying he thought through all this. I don't know nearly enough about the guy to know what his like personal thoughts were. But the structure of establishing a dictionary as the repository of correct language and correct usage is to identify that, right? It's even if what he was saying was, I just want there to be like a consensus so that even though, there's the Carolinas and there's Maine, we all kind of maintain this core, because he identified, I think, somewhat accurately that language is potentially the most impactful element of culture, that if you take people and you have them speak a different language, they are not going to think of themselves as belonging to the same group of people. You could change other things, you can change skin color and we're all still Americans or whatever. But I honestly think this is part of why there is such a absurd and terrible what's the word I'm looking for? I think this is part of why so many people are so, I guess they would say concerned, but I would say like xenophobic and racist and exclusive toward Hispanic people, Hispanic immigrants, Spanish speaking immigrants, is because of the language. That's why like English as a national language was such a big issue to represent this for so long. Anyway, that was his idea, right? Is as long as we all speak the same language, we will all still think of ourselves as being the same people. And I think there's a lot of validity to that concept. But you can't stop people from speaking differently in linguistic drift. But what you can do is identify that there is a correct way of speaking and all other versions of that are incorrect. And so we all are still the same people because we all speak this language. And then it's like, well, but these people speak differently. Yeah, but they're doing it wrong and they don't count and they're low class and their opinions don't matter. They're just uneducated. Again, I don't know that if that was his thinking, maybe it was, but I do think that's a big part of when people are talking about using words correctly or incorrectly, or how embarrassing it is to use a word incorrectly or whatever. It's because we associate correct as being the way the dictionary defines it.
Yeah.
Including to the extent that when I say to people things like, "What do you mean by that?" They'll say like, I don't know. Like, no, you do, know
Right.
what you mean, but they're assuming that my question is, what is the dictionary definition?
My sister will send me, like, when I'm like, I don't know what you mean by that. She's like, the dictionary literally says right here. I'm like, yeah, but what did I write you?
The dictionary just does not matter in actual functional conversation.
Yeah.
It matters in certain contexts, academic writing, or just the more that you're doing something that's meant for wide distribution, the more you want to rely on like common understandings or having a resource that when someone doesn't know what you're saying, they can check something. So the more it's meant for wide distribution, the more important it is to try and stay with like the common or the dictionary definition. But yeah, no, there's the dictionary, according to linguistics, there are, I can't even remember the number, 7, 11 different types of definition. And the dictionary only includes 1 or 2 types of
Sure.
definitions.
Interesting.
Every single word has many other ways of defining it that does not go into a dictionary.
What a mess.
Like a lexical definition, which is defining the term as it relates to the person using the term. Like the word "this" is something that only has a lexical definition. It refers to a relationship between the speaker or writer and the object versus that. I am nearer to this, I am further from that. Inclusive definitions, which is just literally listing everything that is defined by the term,
I love a good thesaurus.
et cetera, et cetera. The dictionary is useful when my choir tries to tell me that a different way to pronounce a word doesn't exist, and the dictionary tells me a majority of people in the world pronounce it the way I was talking about. Yes, and I like that story, and it's funny. And
Right when
just
I
in case, I think it's clear to you, but just in case anyone's watching it, it's not clear. That whole story is about, arguing whether somebody is right or wrong, which is a silly way to talk.
I will look up YouTube videos of like how to pronounce words. But then people have made fake YouTube videos tricking you of how to pronounce words. And I'm like, is this a real one or is this a faker?
Here's a funny thing. Another little factoid, but that is funny.
Word of the day.
The word OFTEN, a word that is spelled that way,
Mhm.
the quote unquote correct pronunciation is often.
Often.
But there are people who will pronounce it as often
Mhm.
because they think that that's the correct way. The reason it's pronounced often is because that is the most efficient way to produce that set of sounds. So that's the way that everybody learns to speak that word. So when someone says often, it indicates that, except in like some rare edge cases where somebody grew up with parents who pronounced it that way, but it is not a way that is pronounced in any dialect largely. So mostly what it indicates is that that person put specific effort into changing their pronunciation from often to often because they thought often was the correct way and they wanted to say it correctly. And they think that they're sounding smart, but they're actually saying something incorrect.
I think I've been doing that often. More often than not. Don't like that. Don't like that, Brandon. Don't like
Or
that one bit.
another one is the word UTTER
Mhm.
and the word UDDER.
Mhm.
Everyone pronounces both those words as udder. I'm utterly exhausted.
Uh-huh.
That cow has an udder. And the one is TT, one is TD.
Uh-huh.
And people will think like, oh no, they should be pronounced differently. We're just kind of being sloppy and lazy in our pronunciation.
not.
So people will be like, no, utter versus udder. It is not. The sound there is called a velar flap. It's when you flick the tip of your tongue across the velar ridge, which is the like bumpy part right behind your teeth. Udder.
So do we just not like to do the T's and like T's are unnecessary? Often, utter.
See the thing? These actually follow like rules of pronunciation that if you learn the International Phonetic Alphabet, it becomes much more clear. And those rules, again, are not, just like the dictionary, people are doing it backwards. These rules of pronunciation are not about what is proper or correct. It's you observe the way that people pronounce it and then record that. And the way that people pronounce it is dictated by what's the most efficient way to make the sound.
That's interesting.
Because over time, like We
The efficient way.
Here's a really fun one. The word FOR. How is that pronounced?
FOR for
Except nobody ever pronounces it that way.
for
Not even that. The word FOR is typically pronounced as. If I say, "Do you want to come over for dinner?" I'll say, "Do you want to come over for dinner?" Do you want to come over for dinner? It's called a weak form. English has something called weak forms, where the words get pronounced in their weak form unless they are being emphasized. Unless I'm saying I'm asking you to come over for dinner, not with dinner, right? They get pronounced in the weak form, which is like a basic, bare minimal thing.
every time I hear a new one, I like see the universe in my head.
When I was a kid and I learned there was a different way to pronounce route or route, I decided the way that didn't rhyme with root was better because it was easier to differentiate, and I just adapted it into my vocabulary, and I still pronounce it route today. And by rhyme, I mean doesn't rhyme, just sounds the same.
Root. I don't ever say root. I say route as well.
Not true. I bet I can prove it. Do you know the song about the one of those that is number 66? Sing that.
I don't want to.
I thought you say Route 66.
I don't ever do that in conversation.
I know, I'm just saying, context matters.
Okay, Brandon.
People like to simplify and think that we understand, but we're abstracting stuff and we're
You're being
prioritizing.
pedantic.
Okay. I mean, I'm not, but I understand that I might be having the impact or coming across as though, because pedantic is only about saying whether it's right or wrong for no other purpose than that it's right or wrong. That's the point of the dictionary and proper pronunciation.
There's no right
Like literally British RP, which most people just think of as like the Hugh
or wrong.
Grant
You
dialect.
be calling him pedantic.
So British RP is the fancy
Yes.
British
But
dialect.
darling.
Yes, the thing that people think of as like Hugh Grant or whatever. It's called RP.
I just finished House MD about 3 weeks ago. All of it.
Uh,
We can talk about that another time.
RP stands for received pronunciation. Because British RP is not an actual
Oh,
dialect.
Hugh Laurie. Oops.
Oh, you're thinking
Yeah.
Hugh Laurie. Yeah, I was wondering about.
Yeah.
I'm sure it is at this point now, probably an actual like dialect native to a particular place that children just learn growing up. But originally, it was a class marker. You
Yeah.
would go to a certain kind of school, like Eton or whatever, and they would teach you to speak with that pronunciation. And so it was a sign that I have been to one of these schools. That's just by
That's
the way I
helpful
sound.
for me to know because when I was learning it, I'm like, where are we? Like, I was just associating it with like class, and I didn't know.
There's a reason we associate it with upper class
Yeah.
and educated because that is literally what. Again, I don't know. It's possible that by now there are certain enclaves where that is just the pronunciation that
Or
children learn
Noel
growing up.
Coward play.
The American like pseudo version of that is sometimes called the like news anchor dialect,
Mm-hmm.
where what you're trying to do in either case is remove any marker of location. You're trying to make it so that people cannot tell just by listening to you where you're from. So correct pronunciation by definition is pronunciation that is artificial. It has to be art. If it was natural, it would be associated with a particular region or
Oh,
culture.
there's a whole YouTube dialect too now of like the way YouTubers present certain things and the information. I don't know enough about it to say more, but it's like it drives me crazy. And
I'm looking into that.
yeah, please
But do
do.
you just mean like certain word usage? Or?
No, it's like I'm giving you information, and I'm going to end the sentence this way every single time I am talking. Blah 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 blah. The fact is this.
So that's one of the things about tonal speech in English.
But it's the same in the YouTube videos. Every single one I'm watching.
Oh, sure.
It drives me nuts.
It would probably not, maybe, but I'm guessing it would not like meet the criteria of being a dialect so much as just like that would be kind of like saying that there's a movie trailer voice dialect or whatever, just because in a particular context
in a world
Right,
where
right.
blah, 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 and I'm sure that people have referred to it as a dialect.
Yeah, that's probably what
I
it
don't
is.
doubt you. And maybe it does meet the criteria of being a dialect, but I don't think so. It's more just like people imitate success. And there then become things that are like standard to the form. Same with like if you watch any political speech, there's going to be certain things that are similar to other political speeches that are not similar to any other way of speaking. Donald Trump does not follow those conventions. That's part of, I think, what people interpret as him being real is that he's just not following those conventions.
Like
Like the transatlantic
transatlantic.
accent.
Makes me think of radio plays.
Yeah, I mean, modifying the way that your speech sounds without modifying the words that you're using is something that conveys information. And so it is not like an inauthentic thing for people to then attempt to increase their awareness of that and utilize it in order to convey what they're trying to convey. That's, again, that'd be like saying that using words that you didn't learn growing up is fake. That, yes, how you sound impacts how you dress. If you dress differently than the way you dressed growing up, is that fake and inauthentic, or are you making deliberate decisions about how you present yourself to other people in order to give them the impression that you're trying to give?
I'm thinking about meeting people who like speak the same way as I do, and if I'm aware of it or not.
Another fun thing
Another tidbit.
is that there are many things, there are like cycles of people identifying a certain part of speech that isn't about word choice, although sometimes it's about word choice, that they associate with young women and talking about that as though it's a huge problem because it gives the impression that you're dumb or insecure.
Like vocal fry?
Like vocal fry is a more recent version of that. And most of the time, these things are not things that are unique to young women. Vocal fry is, listen to most podcasts and you'll hear, especially like kind of NPR podcasts where people are talking kind of softly and quietly and whatever. Like what I'm doing right now, this is vocal fry because there are little gaps between this, like the sound is bumpy, right? And it's not always so exaggerated as but just this, there's bumpy in and out. And especially in America, we tend to use vocal fry like meaningfully at the ends of sentences to convey a particular meaning. Especially like it's kind of a way of doing an ellipses in spoken word. If you're like, so then we go, right? Like you switch to the vocal fry and it indicates like, what's the next thing?
Language is so funny.
That's like me when I'm tired, which is me always. Yes, this is not a new thing.
The visual I have of this person now.
It is not like correlated to women or young women at any like greater rate than anybody else. And the funny thing is, maybe funny is not the right word. What happens is people think of young women as dumb or insecure. And so then anything that they think that those young women are doing, they identify as something that makes you seem as though you're dumb and insecure, because they don't like to think of themselves as thinking that young women are dumb and insecure. So they're like, yeah, when you play with your hair, it makes you seem nervous and insecure. Yeah, but the only people you think of playing with their hair are young women, and the only reason you think it makes somebody insecure is because young women do it. Literally, this one is so annoying. It's not a language thing, but just to make this point. In the book,
An accurate picture.
an
An accurate picture.
uh,
Do you understand what they're talking about?
No.
It was me being like this. The image I have of this person.
Oh.
It's just like a vocal fry person now.
Yeah, this had the Valley Girl accent, which was going up at the end of sentences.
Is that why it's called Valley Girl?
No, it's called Valley Girl because it's associated with the San Fernando Valley.
Oh, I was like valleys?
Yeah. No, the valley is in Southern California. There's like LA and Long Beach and whatever out on the coast. And then there's the valley, which is inland.
That makes
And
more
there's
sense.
a lot more money there.
That makes more sense.
And the thing that like mostly gets us, if you ask most people about Valley Girl, they'll say the word like a lot. But again, everybody uses filler words. They are culturally different. In America, kind of the most common versions of that are and You know, it's like right? It's like using like as a filler word is a different filler word than In the UK, is the most common filler word as opposed to But using like as a filler word, we associate with like, oh, makes them sound stupid. They're using a filler word just like anybody does. It's just different than the one that you utilize.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is going up on the ends of sentences, which is called a minor tone. And mostly Americans use that to indicate a question. If I go up at the end of a sentence, it turns a statement into a question like, so you want to meet at 8, right? Like, or we're going to meet at 8. If I say it like that, we're going to meet at 8, goes down in pitch on the end, it's a statement. If I say we're going to meet at 8 and go up in pitch at the end, then it's a question. So
That's right.
when young women speak by saying like, I went to the mall, and then other people will say like, it sounds like everything you're saying is a question. But it serves another common purpose too, which is as a continuation, meaning I'm not done with my statement yet. I went to the mall, and there's more to my story. If I say I went to the mall, then it sounds like I'm done, unless I quickly say I went to the mall and. If I say I went to the mall, then you're waiting
What
for the next thing.
happened?
And that's part of what people are getting annoyed by is they're like, like keep going or whatever. But when they think about it intellectually, they don't identify it as that. So instead, they're just like,
Oh, I do.
you
this.
sound like you're questioning, which makes you seem insecure. No, I think you're insecure. I'm reading you as
Right.
insecure, and now I'm identifying the reasons that I think that, and it's definitely about something you're doing, not about anything else about who you are or what's impacting what I'm saying. But yes, vocal fry, upswings, these are like not unique to young women. They just, same way. I use this example for a reason. This is nervous, playing with my hair indicates that I'm nervous in our culture. This, playing with my facial hair, indicates that I'm serious and pensive. Literally, the physical action is the same, just rubbing my hairs against one another.
I can't.
This is nervous, this is serious. Well, who's more likely to have hair down here to be able to play with this way, and who's more likely to have facial hair here to play with this way? This is the same problem that comes up with eye contact, because again, our culture is built on this idea that there's correct and incorrect usage of these things, as opposed to common, which is a real thing and should be paid attention to. It's worth knowing. Like, in fact, one of the things that people will think that I do that I don't actually do is correct, incorrect word usage. Where like if somebody says, I don't know, I'm trying to even think of an example. I can't think of an example right now. But if somebody uses a word differently than most people use that word, that's how I phrase it. Like at first I'll say, wait, help me understand, because they're using a word in a way that I'm not interpreting it. And when they point out, like when they help clarify, oh, okay, I get what happened there. What happened there is you used a word that most commonly is used for this other thing. And I explicitly say it as, so that doesn't mean you're using it incorrectly, but it is good for you to know that it's quite likely that people will interpret it in this other way, because the most common usage of it is this other thing. I very specifically don't talk about right and wrong, not just to be polite or PC, but because right or wrong is not.
Yeah, I think every time you've been like, I don't care about the dictionary definition. What do you think? I'm like, but I do. Can't
Nobody
be simple.
does. That's not how
I
speech
know.
works. That's a learned thing.
Yeah.
It would be like saying that there's and I'm using this for a reason. It would be like saying that there is a correct and incorrect way to dress or eat food, right? Like these are other things that there have also been attempts over the years to create a standard, write it down, and say this is right, and you shouldn't do anything else, knowing that other people are going to do it differently than that all over the place, but we've just labeled that as incorrect now, as opposed to a different way of dressing or a different way of using utensils to eat your food. It's wrong, which we can associate with low class or dismissible, an indicator that someone is not valuable. They don't care. They're not respectful. They're not serious. That effectively, there's a lot of these things that we have turned it into one particular way of doing it as recorded in this particular set of texts. If you do it that way, it means that you are a serious person who should be taken seriously. And if you do it any other way, it means you are a person who should be dismissed. And our whole culture is built on this. So we're using all of this as like markers of credibility. Back to the misattributing. Oh, I am in fact a toad that cannot decide when it's done croaking. Part of what we were talking about earlier with attributing quotes differently is because we do this. It's called the appeal to authority fallacy. The logical fallacy that a particular thought or statement is true or more likely to be true because a certain person stated it or agrees with it. So much of what we're doing in all cultures, this is not unique to our culture, is communicating to others something that we can roughly group up and call status. Like, how much is it worth for you to pay attention to me and the things that I do and that I say? So we're all playing this game where we're giving signals to one another, sometimes knowingly and deliberately, sometimes not. Sometimes we're giving a signal we think will come across in one way but comes across differently, or signals that are interpreted as an indicator of I'm a person worth listening to if X or Y is true about the person looking at me, but if any other thing is true, like if I want metalheads to take me seriously, I'm going to dress in a way that's going to make anyone who's not a metalhead take me less seriously, right? We're doing this thing as a way to indicate, like, of your limited attentional resources that are being pulled in all kinds of directions, I'm signaling to you that it is worth spending some attention on me, which we're all incentivized to do. And we use all these fallacies, appeal to authority, and all these other ones as ways of trying to get that attention and signifying class. And even if we're not thinking about it as class, that is part of it. But there's other ways. It's not only that.
That's so funny that my brain, when I hear the word class, automatically thinks like just upper, and I don't think of like the other classes that exist.
Yeah. Well, this is like, you can't be taken seriously as a metalhead unless you only drink hot water with lemon and honey.
Or a liquid death.
Yeah.
That's
well,
all
that's
rich.
like a metal vocalist,
Yeah.
Like,
That's fair.
whatever.
I'm thinking about an audience member.
Which is, that's a good example. We might use metalhead to mean different things. To me, metalhead is, to me, it's a fan of metal, not necessarily a performer.
Yes, me too.
And again, that's the point. It's not that my usage is correct and yours is not. Metalhead is not even in the dictionary that we could go reference and
Not
see.
yet.
There's a reason that Urban Dictionary is such a popular site and has it's
Also
like one
metal,
of the,
there are so many types of metal
Yeah.
to get into. There's a whole black metal map.
yeah, but you don't call people black metalheads or death metalheads. They're all metalheads.
No, you go into it.
You talk about the thing, but there's
My boyfriend has he likes black metal, and he's a comedian, and he has a whole thing where he dissects each of the types of music and what that actually is. It's quite funny.
I believe it.
Could I repeat it back? Not at
I
all.
would like to see that. He sounds like, now being more careful because I didn't word on the end.
we can save it.
He sounds like a comedian who does work that I would be interested
Yes.
in that involves I think there is it's often called observational comedy, but it's not always observational comedy. I think there's a certain type of comedy, this is true of all art, like all the various forms of art, but there's a certain type of comedy that is entirely built on I am a person who is observing our culture in a way that other people don't really pay attention to. And now let me share observations with you about stuff that is weird if you pay attention to it,
Yes.
but you've never paid attention to it.
He's also very big on seeing a structure and then messing with the structure of things. It's language.
Sorry, my sister told me a story about seeing a singer for a metal band at the bar drinking
Honey and a man
lemon
a fresh
and
on
fresh
you.
on me. It's what I think of when I think metal music now. Yeah, well, because
That's funny.
metal vocals, especially certain genres or
Mhm.
whatever, but involve a lot of really harsh vocal fry that's very difficult on the
I
throat.
guess you would call it vocal fry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so because that's the thing, I did this earlier as the movie trailer
voice, which isn't as common or relevant these days, but we still have that cultural concept of the like, in a world where some people blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Like that's vocal fry.
So funny.
Like vocal fry is.
Everywhere.
I mean, like Tom Brokaw has very strong vocal fry and is considered and has been considered one of the most respected voices in America.
Yeah, it's so weird because I don't like you have it, I have it. I just don't ever apply that. I know he's very good at that voice.
Oh, well.
Wasn't even trying.
No, I was trying. I was gonna say I've practiced it. I did dialect work, and I'm a deep voiced man, and I was an actor. And
You can continue. I want to know what happens after. In a world.
the only thing I usually reference with that, because my wife also referenced it, is a bit from a comedian named Pablo Francisco,
Okay.
because he also does voices like that, and he just will like he makes up a movie and then makes the trailer for it, and so he makes up a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Keanu Reeves called Little Tortilla Boy.
Okay.
He's like, in a world where one man sells tortillas, I'm selling tortillas, and the mob want it in. They're after my tortillas!
Oh my god.
They knew too much. We know too much. It's also why some
So
people
dumb.
get so many impressions done of them, because their voice is not only very distinct, but also very easy to replicate.
Mhm.
It's like everybody can do a Christopher Walken. They're varying quality,
Yes.
but because
Yes.
his isn't just. So when we're talking about dialect, right? There's the change in the sound, what in dialect we refer to as substitutions. Did you do dialect work? I assume you did.
Yeah, Natalie
Oh, right.
taught me.
So like in Irish, there's an substitution. So where we Americans would use an sound like cup, they use an sound, cup, like book. Cup. So substitutions are about swapping out the sound. Like in a Californian certain kind of like dialect, you would do an substitution. So we'd say we're coming to the end instead of the end.
I learned a very specific Orkney Island Scottish accent with Natalie, our mutual acquaintance, and
Was it for a Martin McDonough show?
it's for a show called Southie Between Land and Sea. And it was interesting having to like know some like standard Scottish dialect, whatever that means, and also adjust it so an audience could understand what you're saying. And then people would get mad in the audience because you're saying it in a different pronunciation. But we're like, but that's the Orkney Island way, and just like the politics that came with it. It's very interesting.
Yeah, well, especially islands like that linguistic drift
Yeah.
we were talking earlier about, like because America was founded at a time where like it didn't spread too much before the development of transportation that enabled like a more consistent, like one of the kind of defining characteristics of American culture is the mobility of it. That's a relatively unique thing.
Mhm.
Like,
We're huge.
yeah, I mean, this is part of the like Americans in their cars kind of a thing, or like where Americans will get genuinely confused about the fact that like Germany and France are both roughly the size of many American states.
Right. I think about that all the time. Of like, of course we can't get along. We're like so many countries combined. Like,
Well, and that's the thing. We think of it as like, we assume those other countries are huge, partly because our country is physically huge,
right.
but also because there is such a cultural distinction between those two things that just does not exist between Utah and Colorado, even though they're the same size.
Right.
And part of it is because America as a culture was developed much more recently when technology I mean, there was, even in the early days, you know, like the Pony Express and whatever, right? Like, so our culture is weird with this kind of stuff. I don't
Should we
know
start
what else
wrapping
I'm
up?
trying to say that. Yeah, we should probably wrap up. That was the linguistic drift thing. That's why
Yeah.
two different towns 20 miles away from each other have entirely different things, because there were centuries of drift and there just wasn't that. And most of the like very notable drift in the United States is from areas that were settled by white people, not only white people, but the ones where white people live early on.
Is that what a phrase, catch my drift?
No, I don't think so.
Is that a phrase?
That is a phrase.
Okay.
You catch my drift, yeah. I don't know. I always associate that with
Driftwood?
like surfer culture. Because the drift, I don't know. Driftwood is called driftwood because drift is like the water, the tide or whatever moves
It's very
a certain way.
interesting.
But yeah, like the Southern dialect and the New England dialect and all these like very distinct, the New Yorker and the New Jersey, they're all
Minnesota.
like, so Midwest is then as we're like starting to, the country of the United States is starting to colonize further and further west as time moves forward and technology advances. So the Midwest still has some drift, but not nearly as much, to the point that the Midwest is generally kind of considered the more like normative
Common,
whatever.
intelligent sounding.
Yeah, well,
That's
that news anchor dialect is roughly based on a like Midwestern dialect. But if you ask somebody like, what's an Idaho dialect or a Montana or Dakota
Right.
or Arizona, other than like very specific subcultures in California, and again, the dialects as you move further west are associated with interests like countercultures
Mhm.
rather than like regional.
sure.
Anyway, yeah, we'll wrap up. There's no right, there's no wrong. That doesn't mean that there's like no difference between things, which is kind of the insidious part about people being trained to believe that there's like correct and incorrect, this right and wrong, whatever, is that they think the only alternative is madness where nothing matters. So if you say like, it's not about
Me
correct or
sometimes.
incorrect, and people are like, no, but there's a difference. Yes, there's a difference. Correct and incorrect is a specific, correct just means it matches with a pre-described way of looking at it.
Mhm.
But we think of correct as good
Mhm.
or true instead of just accurate to the particular way it is described or defined. So just utility over accuracy. If you get your point across, does it matter if ain't is in the dictionary or not? No.
No, it
If
ain't.
ain't isn't in the dictionary, then the dictionary is behind.
Right.
Not people are speaking a language that doesn't exist. Obviously, the
They're
language
speaking.
exists. So we don't need to police each other. And it is also still useful to have common definitions and resources to be able to interpret one another. You need a balance. You can't be correct if English isn't real. Even the fact, like, English and, like, this isn't England, but we still
That
call
always
it
bothers
English.
me. I'm like, surely I must be wrong.
I mean, it is English because we're speaking the language that was developed in England.
I remember last thing it was like a quiz on a book we read for class, and it said, what kind of book is this? And I sat there for so long. I knew it was science fiction, but I also knew it was a novel, and I wrote novel. I don't know why I wrote novel. Is novel even a,
As a genre,
I didn't put it
I
together.
didn't put your
It's okay.
story together.
It doesn't matter. It really
I just
doesn't.
think it's funny that, like, I was thinking about, yes, Americans speak English, Brazilians speak Portuguese, Mexicans speak Spanish.
Right.
Like,
Spain. Mm-hmm.
Haitians speak French or a Creole.
Mm-hmm.
English is every other American is. All right, thank you. Good to be with you all. We will be back next week, same time.
Yeah.
Be well.
Thanks.
It's like whack-a-mole to hit both those buttons quickly enough.
Are there 2 buttons?
Not usually, but to work. Sometimes it does this thing where